Hi, this is Reverend Karen, and I'm here to talk about the very last part of the Lord's Prayer. Now, this is new to everybody. We'd got as far as deliver us from evil before lockdown. And so the last part is new to everybody. So here we go. It goes. For yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Now, Amen at the end is what Christians say at the end of their prayers, and it means I agree. So I agree with what's just been said. Amen. And this last part of the Lord's Prayer is called the doxology. And that's a fabulous word, doxology. And it means hymn of praise. For yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. So what this part of the Lord's Prayer does is act a bit like a bookend. So if you can think right back to the beginning, we have Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And at the end, we have for yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. So the first part reminds us that God is God and God is not us, and God is divine and worthy of praise because God is holy. And the last part says exactly the same thing. God is not us, it's God's kingdom, not our kingdom. God is powerful and glorious and eternal. So acts like bookends. Praise at the beginning, praise at the end. So all very simple, but actually it isn't. Because there are two versions of the Lord's Prayer in the Bible. One comes from the Gospel of Luke and one comes from the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew has the version we're learning, which has got this bit at the end, the doxology. For yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. But the Gospel of Luke has a shorter version. So why might that be? So we're going to put a bit of historical thinking hats on now. I don't know if you do thinking hats in school. We did when I was at school. We put thinking hats on. So we're putting our historical hat on and wondering why there might be two versions of the same story. So I'm going to pause whilst you have a think about that. So I wonder what you came up with. Now, if anyone cheated and looked online, it wouldn't have helped because there are two theories and nobody quite knows which one is right. So, the first theory about why there are two versions is that you have people recording and remembering events differently, and it happens. If you observe something, you watch something, we've all got our individual memories and we remember things differently. So it might be that the person who wrote the Gospel of Matthew may or may not have been called Matthew, but he would be remembering perhaps things differently from the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And they were written sometime after Jesus died. So there would have been eyewitnesses, but perhaps they weren't the people that wrote the text, or maybe they were. Again, we don't know. So it could be that people are remembering things differently, and that's why we have two versions. That's one theory. The second theory is to do with how old manuscripts were copied. Now, if you write your homework and you hand it in to your teacher, that is an original text. You could copy it by scanning it, or you could copy it by photocopying it. But they couldn't do that 2,000 years ago. What they did is somebody would very carefully write it out by hand, and they'd copy it word for word. And so, of course, mistakes slipped in. But a whole section like, for yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever, amen, is quite a big bit to get wrong, to slip in by mistake. So there is a theory that says that this is a separate prayer. The doxology is a separate prayer. And it got tacked onto the Lord's Prayer by a monk, because they were mostly monks who were copying manuscripts. And he was so used to saying this separate prayer at the end of the Lord's Prayer when they used it in their worship services that it kind of slipped in through force of habit. And maybe that happened. We don't know. And that's the fascinating thing with history, is that we really don't know. There could be many explanations, but what we have is a version of the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Matthew, which Christians all over the world use. And that's many, many, many millions of people over the past 2,000 years have used this version of the Lord's Prayer. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't. They leave out the doxology, they leave out this bit. So they end, so if you were at Sacred Heart School, you would learn the Lord's Prayer and you'd finish with "Deliver us from evil." Whereas the other denominations, there are many versions of Christianity. We're not just one lot, there's lots of versions. So those of us who aren't Roman Catholic use this ending, which is the bookend. We start with praise and we end with praise. For yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. So we've learnt a bit of a prayer, and we've learnt a bit about history, and we've learnt how monks would copy texts and copy and copy and copy. And sometimes they made mistakes. And maybe sometimes they added something. Or maybe they didn't. History. Fascinating. See you next time.